Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into surviving slavery in ancient Egypt. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to our channel. Doing so helps more than you can imagine. Now, get comfortable and enjoy our look at life in ancient Egypt. To understand what life was like for an average Egyptian slave, you must first understand this. Slavery in ancient Egypt was not based on skin color, and it was not always a punishment. It was a system, ancient, efficient, and deeply embedded in Egyptian society for over 2 millennia. And unlike the pyramids that define its grandeur, this system was invisible by design. It left few names, fewer voices. So where did slaves come from? The first answer is conquest. The golden age of Egyptian slavery was the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, a period of empire, expansion, and relentless warfare. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II extended Egyptian rule deep into Nubia and across the Levant, capturing thousands of foreign prisoners in the process. These captives, men, women, and children, were marched back to Egypt as living spoils. Some were presented ceremonially to the gods. Others were handed to temples, nobles, or state estates. The lucky ones were pressed into service. The unlucky, sacrificed or worked to death in quarries and gold mines. There are carved reliefs of these conquests. You'll find rows of bound captives with distinct ethnic features, beards curled just so, Nubian hairstyles, Asiatic garb, presented to the pharaoh in orderly submission. These weren't depictions of savages, they were trophies. Evidence of victory. And their fate? Enslavement, with no return. But conquest wasn't the only pipeline. Debt was another. In Egypt, a person who could not repay their obligations might offer themselves or a family member as a bondservant. These individuals were not war captives. They were Egyptians, farmers who failed to meet tax demands, craftsmen who borrowed too much, widows left without support. The law allowed creditors to enforce bondage as payment. Entire households could be pledged in exchange for food, land, or survival. Then there were the children. Born of enslaved mothers, they were slaves by default. No choice, no paperwork, no ceremony. Just the weight of their mother's status falling over them like a stone. In the temples, these children were documented in long lists. Girl, property of the gods. Boy, assigned to bakery labor. They were raised in servitude, taught obedience before speech, and sent to work as soon as they could carry a bucket or sweep a floor. Slavery in Egypt wasn't a singular thing. It was a spectrum, layered, local, and bureaucratic. At the top were slaves of the state. These individuals, often foreign-born, worked massive royal estates, temples, and construction projects. Though their lives were grueling, they were at least documented, fed by state rations, counted in census rolls, given crude medical treatment when necessary. They were assets, and the state protected its property, up to a point. Then there were private slaves, owned by nobles, priests, or wealthy citizens. Some were field hands, some domestic servants. Some were scribes, trained to manage their master's accounts. Status varied wildly. A household cook might earn small rewards, scraps of jewelry, better housing, even a chance at freedom. But a farm laborer or stable hand could be beaten to death without consequence. And finally, there were the unrecorded, people not even dignified with a tally mark. Unnamed, undocumented, they lived and died in the margins, known only by their labor. It's tempting to ask, were Egyptian slaves treated better than those in Rome or America? The answer isn't comforting. Better is a scale of brutality. Ancient Egypt was rigidly hierarchical, deeply conservative, and utterly convinced of divine order. In that system, Pharaoh stood at the top, a god king, and everyone else existed to maintain ma'at, balance, harmony, structure. The slave was not merely property, they were part of that cosmic order. Their suffering wasn't seen as injustice, it was necessity. Even kindness could be a tool of control. Temple records from Thebes and Karnak list slaves in astonishing numbers, some temples owning hundreds, even thousands. These weren't just religious centers, they were economic powerhouses, running granaries, breweries, textile workshops, all fueled by enslaved labor. Their gods needed offerings, and offerings required hands. Women, too, were enslaved in great numbers. Many were forced into domestic service, child-rearing, or textile work. Others, especially young and foreign, were taken as concubines. A few rose in status, becoming favorite servants or bearers of noble children. But this was exception, not rule. For most, their identity ended at ownership. And what of the law? Egyptian legal records make it clear. Slaves were property. They could be sold, loaned, or inherited. Contracts survive describing the sale of a person in the same breath as livestock or land. There were clauses about feeding, clothing, and not abusing slaves without cause, but enforcement was laughable. A slave had no standing to bring charges, no recourse, no future that wasn't granted by whim. Yet not all hope was extinguished. There were paths, narrow, difficult, rare, toward manumission. A loyal slave might be freed by their master's will. Some temples allowed favored slaves to serve as paid workers. Occasionally, freed individuals even acquired wealth and land. There are recorded instances of freed slaves marrying Egyptian citizens, raising children outside bondage. But for the average enslaved person, this was a dream. Most lived and died without freedom, without recognition, without even a name carved in stone. They were born into chains, and those chains, metaphorical or literal, defined everything that followed. Slavery in ancient Egypt didn't begin at home. For many, it began with defeat, violent, sudden, and absolute. You might have been born in a Canaanite village or a Nubian river town. You may have never even heard of Egypt, the black land of the Nile, with its strange gods and vast tombs. But when Pharaoh's army came, it came with fire and decree. Your world shattered before you knew what it meant to lose. The Egyptian military campaigns of the New Kingdom were vast and methodical. Ramses II, Thutmose III, and Seti I weren't just warriors, they were empire builders. Their conquests stretched from the Euphrates to deep into Kush in modern-day Sudan. They took cities, they dismantled kingdoms. But most of all, they took people. War captives were more than prisoners. They were currency, tribute, tools. Royal inscriptions carved into temple walls proudly boast of bringing home the harvest of foreign peoples. Thousands of men, women, and children chained and branded as living plunder. Some were paraded in festivals to commemorate Pharaoh's glory. Others were marched straight into servitude. Let's be clear, the journey to Egypt was itself a form of violence. Captured populations were often forced to walk hundreds of miles under the whip, with little food, no rest, and no certainty. Survivors would later recall being roped together by the neck, guarded by spear-wielding escorts. Babies were born along the road. The old were left to die. If you collapsed, you were left behind, or worse, put down like livestock. When you finally reached the Nile, it was not as a visitor. You were product. There, scribes, the administrative backbone of Egyptian rule, took over. Captives were inventoried like spoils. 15 Syrian women, 20 Cushite boys, 7 adult males fit for field labor. One scribe might record your existence on a clay tablet or a papyrus roll. Another might brand your skin with a mark of ownership. If you had a name, it was replaced with a label, household servant, stable boy, child of the temple. And so began your second life, as property of the state, the gods, or a noble. The first destination for many was a perkinu, a labor allocation center. These were vast institutions attached to temples, government granaries, or military estates. Here, captives were sorted, assessed, and assigned. Strong men were often sent to farms, quarries, or canal works. Young women might be sent to weaving workshops, bakeries, or elite households. Children were placed wherever small hands were needed, which, in Egypt, was everywhere. There was no family unit anymore. Husbands and wives were separated. Siblings split. You could be sent hundreds of kilometers away from the people who shared your tongue. For many, this separation was the deepest wound, not just the loss of freedom, but the loss of identity through isolation. Your world now spoke a different language, Egyptian. Its sounds were alien, its script unreadable. And yet, you were expected to follow orders, to obey signs, to function immediately in a society that offered no accommodation. Misunderstandings were punished. Resistance brutalized. What did you wear? A loincloth, maybe linen if your work was near temples or elite homes, more likely nothing at all if you labored in the fields. You were shaved, scrubbed, and rebranded to remove all traces of the person you once were. Your former gods were forgotten, your customs erased. You belonged now to a master, to a temple, to Egypt. Some captives, especially those taken from high-ranking families in conquered regions, were treated differently. They were brought into court as symbolic hostages, educated, married into Egyptian families, trained as priests or diplomats. But this wasn't kindness. It was colonization through cultural absorption. And they were the rarest of cases. For everyone else, the Nile wasn't a promise of civilization. It was a gilded cage. And the irony? Egypt needed these people. For all its glory, its economy depended heavily on imported human labor. Foreign slaves shored up its military, ran its fields, built its temples, and kept its palaces clean. Without conquest, and without the systematic processing of enslaved populations, Egypt's power would have faltered. Inscriptions at Karnak and Luxor show long lists of tribute: gold, cattle, ivory, and humans. The temples didn't just pray, they owned. The gods, it seemed, accepted offerings of flesh as well as incense. And what about the captives who didn't become state property? They were sold. Slave markets existed in Egypt, although less like a Roman piazza and more as private contracts brokered by scribes. Buyers included wealthy landowners, military officers, and merchants. Payment might be made in silver, linen, or cattle. Sometimes slaves were exchanged like tools. In return for one female Nubian servant, I give a pair of oxen and 2 baskets of dates. Your fate now rested in the hands of your new master. Some were cruel, others indifferent. A few, very few, were merciful. But make no mistake, no matter how kindly they treated you, you were still a possession. Your comfort was dependent, not guaranteed. And even within Egypt, your foreignness followed you. Captives from Nubia, Canaan, or Libya were visibly different in skin tone, dress, and accent. Many were viewed with suspicion, or worse, as inherently inferior. You were not just enslaved, you were other. Children born of foreign mothers often faced a murky existence. Some were automatically enslaved, marked from birth. Others might be adopted into Egyptian households as servants, not equals. The hope for integration existed, but the path was steep and narrow. And those who tried to escape, some did. Records exist of slaves fleeing across the desert, seeking shelter in other villages or among nomadic tribes. The punishments if caught were swift: public beatings, disfigurement, or death. For most, running wasn't an option. The desert was unforgiving, and Egypt's administrative reach, with its ever-watchful scribes, was vast. So what was left? You adjusted. You adapted. You learned Egyptian commands. You listened, watched, obeyed. You mourned in silence. You survived. You carved out moments of peace when you could, a shared joke among field workers, a kind word from a fellow captive, the rhythm of a song from home sung quietly at night. And the Nile flowed on, indifferent to your suffering, constant as the rising sun. If you were an average Egyptian slave, there was a good chance the fields were your prison. Agriculture was the backbone of Egypt's wealth, and the pharaoh's power was built not only on the Nile's generous floods, but on the labor of those who worked its banks from dawn until long after the sun dipped behind the horizon. And for slaves, the field was both workplace and trap, a place where your body was consumed grain by grain, year after year. Life in the fields was dictated by the Nile. Its annual flood, the Arche, was both blessing and curse. When the river rose, it spread fertile silt across the plains. This made Egyptian soil some of the richest in the ancient world, but also meant that much of the year's planting and harvesting had to be timed perfectly. As a slave, you didn't plan the work, you simply followed orders. In the flood season, you might be ordered to help maintain irrigation channels or haul baskets of wet silt to reinforce embankments. When the waters receded, you would plant in the soft soil, working in long rows that stretched farther than the eye could see. The overseers, often free Egyptians employed by nobles, temples, or the state, enforced the schedule. They carried long canes or whips of hippopotamus hide, not just as tools of punishment, but as constant reminders of authority. Daily tasks varied with the seasons: planting, kneeling for hours in the mud, pressing seeds into the damp earth, irrigating, lifting water from canals with shadufs, counterweighted poles with buckets over and over until your arms burned, weeding, pulling out unwanted growth by hand under the midday sun, harvesting, swinging a sickle of flint or bronze through stalk after stalk of grain, threshing, beating bundles of barley or emmer wheat to separate the grain, winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so the wind could carry off the chaff. The hours were long. In summer, the day began before sunrise and ended only when darkness made the work impossible. Breaks were rare and brief. The tools were basic: wooden hoes, stone-tipped sickles, woven baskets for carrying loads. These broke often, and replacing them was part of your duties. Injuries from splintered handles or dull blades were common and untreated. The conditions were unrelenting. Summer heat could reach well over 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was little shelter in the open fields. In winter, the mornings were damp and biting. You worked barefoot, your feet sinking into the mud or blistering on dry, cracked ground. Rations were basic: coarse barley bread, onions, beans, and a thick, cloudy beer that doubled as hydration. Meat was rare, usually reserved for festivals or for workers in state projects like tomb building. These rations were designed to keep you alive, not comfortable. Malnutrition was common, especially in bad years when the Nile's flood failed. Weakness made the work harder. The work made the weakness worse. The overseer was more than a supervisor, he was the law in the fields. His word was final. Refusal to work, slowing down, or even looking idle could bring swift punishment: a beating, extra rations withheld, or being assigned to the harshest tasks. Egyptian art sometimes depicts overseers in a strangely casual way: men leaning on sticks, watching laborers at work. But these images don't capture the tension they carried. The whip wasn't a decoration. It was used. Women worked alongside men in agriculture. They planted, harvested, and carried water. If they were pregnant, they worked until they could no longer stand, and returned to work soon after giving birth. Infants were often brought to the fields, swaddled, and left in the shade, checked on between tasks. Older children might also join the work, learning early that the fields offered no mercy. Many slaves in agriculture were tied to temple estates. These vast properties were owned by the gods in name, but managed by priests and scribes. Temples received land as donations from pharaohs and elites, and those lands needed workers. Being tied to a temple could mean slightly more predictable rations and seasonal work schedules, but the hours were just as long and the work no less exhausting. State farms, which supplied grain for taxes and royal stores, were even more demanding. These were operated with military precision. If a shipment of grain fell short, the punishment fell not on the scribes, but on the workers. The only respite came during certain religious festivals, when work might pause for a day or two. But for many, festivals meant extra labor, preparing food for feasts, cleaning, carrying water, or assisting in ceremonies. There was no such thing as a weekend, no paid leave, no guaranteed day off. Working in the fields left its mark. Archaeological evidence from the skeletons of ancient agricultural workers shows spinal compression, worn joints, arthritis, and fractures that healed badly. Teeth were worn down from grit in bread made with stone ground flour. Scars told of injuries from tools or punishment. By your late 30s, if you reached it, your body might already be breaking down. But in Egypt, a slave who could not work was still expected to find some use, even if it meant grinding grain or carrying water until death. For most agricultural slaves, life was not a story with chapters. It was a circle. Plant, tend, harvest, thresh, plant again, year after year. No promotion, no change of scenery, no horizon beyond the next field. And in that endless rhythm, the Nile rose and fell, carrying with it the knowledge that your life, like the grain you grew, would be consumed without remembrance. If the fields were the lifeblood of Egypt, the quarries and construction sites were its bones. Here, in the white glare of the desert, you would work not to feed the living, but to glorify the dead, hauling, cutting, and shaping the stone that would outlast even the pharaoh who ordered it. And for an average Egyptian slave, this was the hardest labor of all. Let's start with a truth that's been muddled by myth. The Great Pyramids of Giza were not built by chattel slaves in chains. Archaeology tells us they were largely constructed by paid, conscripted Egyptian workers, peasants drafted during the flood season when farming was impossible. But by the New Kingdom, long after the pyramids, monumental construction still thrived, and by then, slavery was firmly woven into the system. Temples, palaces, tombs, statues, all required huge teams of laborers. Many of those laborers were prisoners of war, debt slaves, or people born into bondage. Your day in stone labor began not at the temple or tomb, but at the quarry. These were located where the finest limestone, sandstone, or granite could be found, often far from any settlement. Quarrying was dangerous work. First came the cutting. You and your fellow workers used copper chisels, dolerite pounders, and wooden wedges soaked with water to split stone from bedrock. The pounding rang in your ears for hours, each blow sending dust into your lungs. The sun was relentless. In the open, there was no shade except what you could create by standing in the quarry's shadow. And when the shadow moved, so did the heat. Granite quarries, like those at Aswan, were even worse. The stone was harder, the labor more punishing, the air filled with a fine grit that coated your skin and clung to your throat. Quarry walls could collapse without warning, burying workers alive. The narrow ledges where you chipped stone were slick with sand and chips. One wrong step could send you tumbling to the floor below. Tools broke often, and when they did, you were expected to improvise or share. Cuts from jagged stone became infected quickly in the heat and dust. The medical care available to slaves was minimal, a herbal poultice if you were lucky, a beating if your injury slowed production. Once the stone was cut, the real ordeal began, moving it. Blocks weighing several tons were dragged onto wooden sledges. Teams of men, sometimes over 100 strong, hauled these sledges over prepared roads lubricated with water or mud to reduce friction. You gripped the rope until your hands bled, leaning forward until your shoulders felt a tear from the sockets. If the road rose even slightly, the work multiplied in difficulty. If the sledge caught on a rock or ridge, the foreman's whip cracked until the block moved again. Some journeys took days, others weeks. Arriving at a building site didn't mean the work eased. It meant it changed. Stone had to be positioned using ramps, enormous structures of mud brick or rubble that spiraled or sloped up to the growing monument. Slaves carried baskets of debris to build or extend these ramps. Others worked the ropes and levers that inched blocks into place. Precision was demanded. The overseers didn't care that your hands trembled from exhaustion. If a block was set poorly, it had to be shifted again, and the blame fell on the laborers. Tomb construction required different skills. Some slaves were trained to carve reliefs or paint walls, though most simply carried materials in and out of the cramped, airless chambers. In the Valley of the Kings, heat and poor ventilation turned the tombs into ovens. Workers fainted and sometimes never woke up. If you were lucky, you might sleep in a nearby workers' village, small clusters of mud brick huts thrown together near the site. These were cramped, shared spaces with straw mats for beds and a communal hearth for cooking. But if you were considered expendable labor, and many slaves were, you might sleep outside, near the quarry or ramp, using your linen kilt as a blanket. Scorpions, snakes, and biting insects were constant hazards. Construction slaves received rations similar to agricultural workers: coarse bread, onions, beans, beer. Those on large state projects sometimes received extra food, dried fish, dates, to keep up strength. But this was never about comfort. It was about keeping you alive just long enough to finish the job. Water had to be hauled in from the Nile or nearby wells, and under the desert sun, it was never enough. Dehydration was constant, your lips cracking, your tongue swollen. The overseer's authority was absolute. Falling behind could mean a public beating, tied to a post while others watched. Attempting to flee was punished severely: branding, mutilation, or death. Sometimes, punishment was collective. If a team failed to move a block on time, everyone suffered. This kept the group in line, but also bred resentment and distrust among workers. Every stone you moved was framed as a service to the gods. Pharaohs were considered divine, so building their temples or tombs was presented as sacred duty. For a free Egyptian laborer, this could be a source of pride. For a slave, it was propaganda, a way to sanctify your exhaustion. The irony was bitter. The gods you were told you served were often not your own. If you were Nubian, Canaanite, or Libyan, your ancestral deities had no place here. The temples you built were monuments to a religion that justified your enslavement. Archaeological remains from workers in quarry and construction sites show extreme wear, herniated discs, fractured limbs, arthritis in the knees and spine, degenerative joint disease. Many died young, their bones marked by years of repetitive, crushing labor. Hands show grooves from years of gripping rope. Teeth are ground down, not just from gritty bread, but from holding tools in the mouth between tasks. Ribs bear healed fractures from beatings. Projects could last decades. A temple begun in one pharaoh's reign might be finished in his grandson's. For the laborer, there was no end. Only the next block, the next ramp, the next monument. When one job ended, you were sent to another. No retirement, no freedom for long service. Just more sand, more sweat, more stone. If you died, there was no ceremony. Your body might be buried in a shallow grave near the site or dumped in the desert. No tomb, no inscription, not even a marker. Your bones became part of the landscape, as anonymous as the grains of sand you once labored on. If the fields and quarries were the harsh, sun-scorched face of slavery in ancient Egypt, the palaces and grand estates were its hidden heart. Here, the work was different, not always less exhausting, but cleaner, more refined, and far more visible to Egypt's elite. In these spaces, the average slave was not just a worker. They were a reflection of their master's status, a living extension of wealth and power. Egyptian palaces were sprawling compounds of limestone halls, open courtyards, gardens shaded by sycamores, and cool rooms perfumed with incense. The homes of the nobility and high priests were smaller, but still impressive, richly decorated, furnished with imported goods, and staffed with teams of servants. For a slave here, every polished jar, every swept floor, every folded linen was part of your responsibility. You might serve one master directly, or be part of a larger household where duties were tightly divided. In elite homes, slaves filled many roles: water bearers, fetching and pouring water for washing, drinking, or ritual use. Cooks and kitchen hands, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, preparing meat, and ensuring food was served on time. Cleaners, sweeping floors, dusting furniture, and scrubbing vessels. Laundry workers, washing linen in basins of Nile water, beating it with wooden paddles, drying and folding it. Childminders, caring for young members of the household, carrying them, feeding them, entertaining them. Attendants, dressing their masters, applying cosmetics, braiding hair, arranging jewelry. Door guards, monitoring entrances and controlling who could approach the master. Some slaves specialized in a craft, weaving fine linen, carving furniture, or creating cosmetics. These skills could sometimes elevate their status, though never enough to make them free without explicit release. In the palace, your day began before the masters. Before dawn, you'd sweep the courtyard, refill water jars, and light the morning lamps. If you were in the kitchen, you'd start grinding grain for bread before the household stirred. Attendants would prepare scented oils and fresh linen for their master's morning toilette. Meals were served promptly and in order. You'd wait silently while the master ate, ready to refill cups or replace dishes. Speaking without being spoken to could earn a reprimand. Evening brought more work, preparing the household for night. Doors were secured, lamps trimmed, beds arranged with fresh mats and linen. If guests were expected, the pace doubled. Floors were scrubbed, gardens swept, food prepared for a feast that might last until the early hours. In the palace, your work wasn't just about function, it was about display. You were part of the scenery, a marker of your master's wealth. Your appearance mattered. You might be given a simple but clean linen kilt or dress. Your hair, if not shaved, was kept neat, sometimes oiled. Skin was washed daily, a rare luxury compared to field laborers. But this grooming wasn't for your comfort. It was for show. You had to look healthy, obedient, and alert, no matter how tired you were. Life in domestic service was unpredictable because it depended on the master's mood. A good mood might mean leftovers from the table, a kind word, or even an old piece of jewelry as a reward. A bad mood could mean a beating for the smallest mistake, a spilled cup, a late arrival, a perceived disrespect. The closer your work brought you to the master, the more dangerous it could be. A water bearer in the garden was less at risk than a personal attendant in the dressing room. In proximity, you became the target for anger, frustration, or suspicion. Female slaves in elite homes often faced an additional layer of exploitation, sexual servitude. Some were concubines to their masters or gifts to powerful guests. Others bore children who, depending on the household's will, might be raised as heirs, servants, or sold away. The status of a concubine, slave, was precarious. She might be favored and live in relative comfort, or she might be discarded the moment her beauty faded or she displeased her master. A small number of slaves in elite households developed valued skills. These could include scribes, literate slaves who managed accounts, inventories, and correspondence. Artisans, some furniture makers, goldsmiths, or painters producing luxury goods for the household. Physicians or healers, rare but sometimes enslaved foreigners with specialized medical knowledge. Such roles could bring better treatment and occasional privileges, like separate sleeping quarters or more varied food. In rare cases, skilled slaves were manumitted for their service, but only at their master's whim. While beatings in the field were public and brutal, domestic punishments could be quieter, but just as cruel. Loss of food, confinement in storage rooms, or being sent to harsher labor outside the home were common threats. Some punishments were meant to humiliate, shaving the head, assigning the most degrading tasks, or marking the body with ash or paint to signal shame. Temples were not the only places for worship. Elite homes had small shrines where offerings were made to household gods. Slaves might be ordered to clean these shrines, prepare offerings, or participate in rituals, regardless of their personal beliefs. This enforced piety was part of assimilation. Even if you were Nubian, Canaanite, or Libyan. Your master's gods were now yours to serve. Compared to the open-air brutality of the quarries, palace work might seem privileged, and in some ways it was. You might avoid sunburn, your hands might not blister from pulling ropes, your rations might be more varied, but the cost was constant surveillance. In the palace, you were never out of sight, never unobserved. Your life was not your own, even in small moments. And unlike the fields, where you could at least speak quietly with fellow workers, palace life demanded silence and stillness. Even your body language had to be controlled. In many cases, children born to slaves in elite homes remained in service. Daughters might become attendants or cooks, sons might serve as pages, porters, or grooms. The cycle repeated generation after generation. Some households took pride in old servants whose families had served for decades, a pride rooted in ownership, not respect. Manumission in the palace was rare. A skilled scribe might be freed in a master's will, or a concubine might be released after bearing a child. But most slaves died in service, their possessions, if any, absorbed back into the household. Even those freed sometimes chose to remain as paid servants. Freedom without resources could mean starvation. If work was the measure of an Egyptian slave's life, food, shelter, and health were its boundaries. These weren't just conditions you lived in, they defined how long you lived at all. Forget the feasts painted on tomb walls, where tables bend under figs, pomegranates, roast duck, and jugs of wine. Those were for the elite. For the average slave, the diet was minimal, the housing crude, and the body, from head to heel, in constant decline. The staple of your diet was bread, not the soft, fluffy loaves you might imagine, but heavy rounds of barley or emmer wheat, baked hard enough to last days. Ground on stone querns, the flour was full of grit from the grinding process, wearing down teeth until they were flat and cracked. To wash it down, there was beer, not the foamy brew of modern pubs, but a thick, porridge-like drink made from fermented barley bread. It was nutritious, providing calories and some vitamins, but low in alcohol and high in sediment. It filled the belly even when little else was available. Alongside bread and beer, onions and leeks were common, cheap, easy to grow, and long-lasting. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans appeared when available. Dried dates might sweeten a rare occasion. Meat was scarce. You might taste it during festivals or if working on a major state project that provided occasional rations of dried fish or small cuts of goat. Milk and cheese were luxuries reserved for higher-ranking workers or special tasks. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was control. Overseers distributed rations according to work output. In temples and state projects, scribes kept detailed records of who received what. Falling ill or slowing down meant smaller portions. For private slaves, food came from the master's household. If they were generous, you might get scraps from their table, pieces of roasted goose or honey cakes. If not, you got the bare minimum to keep you standing. Water came from the Nile or wells, carried in clay jars. In agricultural areas, it was plentiful, but often unclean. In quarries or construction sites, it was scarce and rationed. Contaminated water spread disease easily. Dysentery, parasites, and fevers were common. Beer was safer than water, but in the desert, even thick, warm beer was a blessing. For most slaves, home was a single-room mud-brick dwelling, walls of sun-dried clay mixed with straw, a reed or palm thatch roof, and a dirt floor. In agricultural estates, houses were built in rows, each identical. They trapped heat in summer and leaked cold in winter. Rain turned the floor to mud. Insects, lizards, and snakes shared your space. Palace or temple slaves might live in attached quarters, slightly sturdier, but no more private. Privacy was a concept you didn't own. Rooms were shared, mats laid side by side. Furnishings were minimal, a woven reed mat for sleeping, a basket for belongings, maybe a stool or small table if you were lucky. Cooking was done on clay hearths or simple fire pits outside. Smoke clung to your clothes and walls. Light came from oil lamps when available, otherwise, darkness fell with the sun. The average slave's body was under constant strain. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, leaving you vulnerable to every sickness. Cuts from tools, burns from cooking, or blisters from ropes often became infected. Injuries rarely healed cleanly. Without proper treatment, broken bones set badly, limiting mobility. Chronic joint pain was normal by your mid-20s. By your 30s, your back might be permanently hunched. The Nile gave life and disease. Standing water bred mosquitoes carrying malaria. Parasites like schistosomiasis, bilharzia entered the body through bare feet and irrigation canals, causing fevers, organ damage, and chronic pain. Dysentery, spread through contaminated water and food, could kill within days. Without modern medicine, recovery depended on luck and the body's own strength. Medical care for slaves varied. In temple estates, healers might apply herbal remedies, honey for wounds, garlic for infections, willow bark for pain. Palace slaves might be treated by household physicians, but for most, healing was in the hands of older workers or family using traditional knowledge. This could help. Honey was a natural antiseptic, but it could also harm if the wrong plant or dose was used. Illness rarely excused you from work. Only the most severe fevers or injuries kept you from your duties, and even then, absence could lead to punishment. In the fields, others would cover your tasks, often resentfully. Children born into slavery often suffered stunted growth from poor diet and overwork. They were put to light labor early, carrying water, tending animals, but still faced the same injuries and illnesses as adults. High child mortality was a fact of life. Some parents buried multiple children before seeing one reach adulthood. Religious festivals could bring slightly better food, fresh bread, dates, maybe meat. For some, this was the only time of year they tasted such things. But even festivals could mean extra work, preparing feasts for masters, cleaning temples, or carrying offerings. By middle age, if you lived that long, your body bore the record of your life. Calloused hands, worn teeth, a spine twisted from labor, skin weathered by sun and wind. There were no pensions, no retirement. You worked until you could not, and then you found a lesser task, grinding grain, weaving mats, until death. Slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't maintained only by chains of rope and shackles of bronze. It endured because it bound the mind as tightly as it bound the body. To keep tens of thousands of enslaved people under control, scattered across estates, temples, quarries, and households, Egypt relied on a mix of discipline, fear, ritual, and constant surveillance. These were the invisible chains, the ones that made resistance dangerous and rebellion almost impossible. In almost every setting, the fields, construction sites, palace halls, there was an overseer. Some were former soldiers, others bureaucrats appointed by a noble or temple administrator. Their authority was absolute in their domain. They recorded daily output, issued orders, and decided punishments. Overseers didn't work beside you, they worked over you. They walked the rows, watching for signs of slowness, talking to scribes, making notes in tally sticks or on ostraca, pottery shards used for records. And they were never alone. Guards, often armed with staves, spears, or whips of hippopotamus hide, were stationed wherever slaves worked in large numbers. Their job was twofold: prevent escape and enforce obedience. A whip was more than a weapon, it was a constant presence. Hanging from a guard's belt or held casually in hand, it was a silent reminder of what could happen if you stepped out of line. When discipline was enforced, it was often public. Punishments were staged to make examples. Common methods included beatings, administered with sticks, reeds, or whips. Sometimes on the back, sometimes on the soles of the feet, bastinado, which left a person barely able to walk. Confinement, locking the offender in a storage room or small cell without food or water for a set period. Branding or marking, burning a sign into the skin to indicate a runaway or repeat offender, shaving of the head or eyebrows intended to humiliate, particularly for women, mutilation, cutting off ears, noses, or fingers in extreme cases, especially for repeated escape attempts. In the worst cases, particularly for violent rebellion, execution was swift. Death could come by strangulation, beheading, or being thrown into the Nile. Egyptian masters understood the power of peer pressure. If one slave failed, sometimes all in their work group were punished. This meant that even those who might sympathize with a troublemaker were motivated to enforce discipline themselves. The group became its own warden, keeping the rebellious in check. Physical punishment was only one tool. Far more effective was breaking the spirit. Slaves were stripped of their original names and given Egyptian ones. This wasn't just for convenience, it was a way of erasing cultural identity. Religious rituals were used as tools of control. Slaves from Nubia, Canaan, or Libya were expected to participate in offerings to Egyptian gods, reinforcing the idea that pharaohs rule, and by extension their slavery was divinely sanctioned. In larger estates and temple complexes, there were layers of supervision. Senior slaves or trusted servants acted as informants, reporting to overseers. This created an atmosphere of distrust. You never knew who might be listening or what might be repeated. Conversations were careful, glances guarded. Punishment didn't always mean the lash. Being transferred from a domestic post to quarry labor, or from a temple kitchen to a remote field, was its own form of discipline. The fear of harsher work kept many in line. Once you were sent to a quarry, the odds of returning were slim, not because it was a prison, but because the work itself destroyed the body. Pharaoh was the son of Ra, and Egyptian religious ideology placed him at the center of cosmic order, Ma'at. Serving Pharaoh was portrayed as serving the gods themselves. Slaves, like free Egyptians, were told that disobedience wasn't just rebellion against a man, it was defiance of divine order. This belief wasn't always accepted, but its constant repetition made it harder to resist openly. Children born into slavery were disciplined early. From the age they could walk, they were given tasks. Disobedience was punished immediately, not just to correct the child, but to show other children what would happen if they followed suit. This ensured that by adulthood, submission was second nature. Escaping slavery in Egypt was difficult. The desert was unforgiving, and communities were small enough that strangers were noticed. Runaway notices were recorded by scribes and could be sent ahead to nearby settlements. Rewards were offered for capture, and penalties for harboring fugitives were severe. Some runaways joined desert nomads or fled to borderlands. A few succeeded. Most were caught. Their punishments, branding, mutilation, or death, were designed to discourage anyone else from trying. Large-scale slave uprisings were rare in Egypt compared to later empires like Rome, but there are records of work stoppages, particularly among skilled workers at Deir el-Medina in the 12th century BCE. For ordinary slaves, rebellion was too dangerous. The state was efficient, the social hierarchy entrenched, and the land itself, bordered by deserts, acted as a natural prison. Egypt's slave control worked because it combined several layers: physical force, whips, guards, beatings, psychological submission, renaming, religious indoctrination, social division, informants, ethnic segregation, economic dependency, total control of food and housing. This meant that even if you hated your master, you still needed him to survive. In ancient Egypt, slavery was not just a condition of the body, it was an inheritance. If you were born to enslaved parents, you were a slave from your first breath. No chains were needed. The law itself bound you. For many, the most defining truth of their existence was not how they entered slavery, but that they never had the choice to leave it. In Egypt, as in many ancient societies, the status of a child was determined by the mother. If she was free, the child was free. If she was enslaved, the child was born into slavery, no matter who the father was. This meant that the cycle of bondage was self-sustaining. A master didn't need to purchase new slaves if those already in his household could produce the next generation. Families did exist in slavery, but they were fragile things. A slave could have a partner, raise children, and share a living space, but they had no legal right to keep that family together. Masters could, and did, sell children away, separate spouses, or reassign family members to different estates without notice. Love and slavery was an act of courage. Every attachment carried the risk of being torn apart. In some households, masters encouraged pairings between slaves. A child born in the household increased the master's assets. These arrangements might be left to the individuals, or they might be ordered. Other masters discouraged such relationships, especially among domestic slaves, fearing that family ties could complicate obedience. Pregnancy was no guarantee of lighter work. In the fields, a pregnant woman labored until she physically couldn't. In domestic service, she might continue tasks right up to the onset of labor. Births usually took place in the slave quarters, attended by other women, sometimes experienced midwives, sometimes simply the oldest and most trusted hands available. There were no official records for slave births. The only paperwork was the master's mental note: another mouth to feed now, another pair of hands to work later. Life expectancy for newborn slaves was cruelly short. Malnutrition, disease, and poor sanitation claimed many within their first year. In hot months, flies swarmed over every surface, spreading illness. In colder months, infants wrapped in thin linen could not always survive the chill. Even minor infections, a cut, a cough, could turn deadly without treatment. If a child survived infancy, their early years were a strange mix of freedom and preparation for servitude. Very young children might play in the alleys of the quarters or in the shade of the fields, watched by older siblings or elderly slaves. But these play activities often imitated work, carrying small jars of water, weaving rush mats, shaping clay. By the age of 5 or 6, a child was expected to contribute meaningfully, fetching water, collecting kindling, herding goats, or assisting with cooking. Children learned by imitation. A girl whose mother worked in the kitchens would follow her into the smoky rooms, helping to grind grain or stir stews. A boy whose father worked in the fields might begin planting seedlings or scaring birds from the crops. For skilled slaves, carpenters, weavers, scribes, children were apprentices from an early age, watching every step of their parents' craft. This knowledge could make them more valuable to the master, but it did not free them. By the age of 10, most children were performing nearly adult tasks. There was no protected childhood as modern societies imagine it, no schooling unless a skilled trade required it, no games beyond brief moments in the day. Their bodies developed quickly under constant strain. Their minds matured under the constant awareness that they were property. Perhaps the greatest fear in a slave family was separation. Masters sold children for many reasons: to settle debts, to curry favor, to liquidate assets. A boy might be sold into quarry labor, a girl into domestic service or concubinage. Parents could not protest without risking punishment themselves. Separation was sudden. A child might leave in the morning and never return, their absence becoming just another silent ache in the family. When a master fathered a child with an enslaved woman, the outcome depended on his will and his wife's tolerance. Some children of such unions were freed and raised as legitimate heirs or acknowledged dependents. Others were left in slavery, their paternity ignored in public, their existence a quiet shame. For the enslaved mother, such relationships could be dangerous. A change in the master's affections or the jealousy of his wife could lead to harsher treatment or sale. Elderly slaves who could no longer work heavy tasks often became caregivers for children. They told stories, supervised chores, and passed down practical knowledge. But age did not guarantee safety. An elderly slave who could no longer work at all was a burden. Some masters maintained them out of habit or sentiment, others sold or abandoned them. Despite the pressures to assimilate into Egyptian culture, slave families often tried to pass on fragments of their own traditions. songs, names, stories, recipes. For Nubian slaves, this might mean teaching children a few words of their native tongue. For Levantine slaves, it might be a prayer to an old god whispered before sleep. These acts were quiet resistance, ways of keeping identity alive when the system sought to erase it. By the time a child reached full working age, early teens for most, they had been shaped by years of labor, discipline, and limited opportunity. The system needed no chains if the mind already understood the limits of possibility. A daughter replaced her mother in the kitchens. A son replaced his father in the fields, and the cycle continued, generation after generation. Slavery in ancient Egypt was not a closed circle. It was fed by conquest, tribute, and trade, a steady flow of human lives brought from lands beyond the Nile's fertile banks. From Nubia to Canaan, from Libya to the shores of the Mediterranean, Egypt drew people into its service. Some came as part of treaties, others as spoils of war. All became part of a system that blurred the lines between ethnicity, labor, and status. Egypt's borders were never static. In its strongest periods, the empire pushed south into Nubia, north into Canaan, and west toward Libyan lands. Each campaign brought back captives, not just soldiers, but women, children, artisans, and even princes. The inscriptions on temple walls do not shy away from this. Pharaohs boasted of bringing back the people of the defeated lands in tribute to the gods. These records were both propaganda and a census of the human wealth added to Egypt's labor force. Nubia, Egypt's neighbor to the south, was a frequent target of military campaigns and a primary source of enslaved people. Nubians were valued for their strength, skill as archers, and ability to work in the heat of southern Egypt. Many served in agricultural estates, quarries, or as guards, but Nubians also brought cultural influence. Their music, dance, and craftsmanship found their way into Egyptian households, even as they endured forced labor. The eastern campaigns of the New Kingdom brought captives from Canaan, Syria, and surrounding lands. These people often had skills Egypt desired: pottery, textile production, metalwork. Some Canaanite captives became domestic slaves, working in palaces and temples. Others were set to agricultural labor in the Delta, where their knowledge of Levantine farming methods was put to use. Libyan captives taken from Egypt's western frontier were often used as laborers in construction and estate work. They were also integrated into the military as auxiliaries, a reminder that the boundary between slave and servant soldier was sometimes thin. Not all war captives remained in field labor. Skilled individuals were often redirected to state workshops, making weapons, carving furniture, or producing luxury goods for export and tribute. The state was pragmatic. A captured metalworker from Canaan might be more valuable in a smithy than in a quarry. While most slaves in Egypt came from direct capture or birth into servitude, there was also trade. Egyptian merchants dealt with foreign traders, exchanging grain, gold, or linen for human cargo. These markets were not vast public squares like those in later Roman cities, but smaller controlled exchanges often linked to military garrisons or ports. Over time, many foreign slaves adopted Egyptian dress, language, and religion, willingly or under pressure. Children born to foreign parents in Egypt often spoke Egyptian first. Names were Egyptianized, sometimes replacing original names entirely in official records. By the second generation, many captives were indistinguishable in speech and manner from native-born Egyptians, except in memories of their families and the records of their masters. Egyptian art and literature sometimes depicted foreigners through stereotypes, Nubians as strong, loyal, but primitive laborers. Asiatics, Canaanites/Syrians as skilled traders or cunning schemers. Libyans as hardy desert dwellers, useful in border patrols. These images weren't neutral. They influenced what work captives were assigned and how they were treated. Although the law considered the children of enslaved mothers to be slaves, mixed unions, both consensual and forced, created blended households. In some estates, communities of mixed origin developed their own customs, combining Egyptian and foreign traditions. This was most visible in music, cooking, and small religious practices. A few foreign captives rose to prominence. Skilled warriors from Nubia or the Levant might become trusted bodyguards. Artisans with rare talents could serve in royal workshops. There are even records of foreign-born individuals managing estates or serving as scribes, though these were exceptions that proved the rule. Foreign captives sometimes tried to flee back to their homelands, especially if they had been taken as adults. The deserts made escape nearly impossible without guides, but border raids occasionally liberated captives. More often, resistance took the form of slow work, feigned illness, or preserving non-Egyptian traditions in secret. Despite their low status, foreign slaves left a lasting mark on Egyptian culture. Musical instruments from Nubia, pottery styles from the Levant, and even certain weaving techniques were introduced through the hands of captives. Temples and tomb paintings sometimes showed foreign servants dressed in their original clothing, carrying exotic goods, a visual reminder of Egypt's reach and diversity. At the top, Pharaoh and his court. Below them, nobles, priests, and scribes. Then free farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers. And at the base, the enslaved, native-born, and foreign, side by side in the same dust. What set them apart was not their labor, but their origins. And for many, that origin was a battlefield far from the Nile. For most enslaved people in ancient Egypt, there was no dramatic breaking of chains, no triumphant walk into freedom. Slavery ended in one of two ways, at the will of the master or at the edge of the grave. And even in freedom, the shadow of bondage was hard to escape. Manumission, the formal release from slavery, was possible but rare. A master might grant freedom as a reward for long service, for exceptional skill, or as a gesture of piety before death. Some freed slaves were written into their masters' will, given a small plot of land, or allowed to remain as paid servants. In temples, certain slaves were freed during religious festivals, their liberation recorded as an offering to the gods. But these cases were exceptions, celebrated precisely because they were unusual. Freedom in Egypt was rarely absolute. A newly freed person might still be bound to their former master through debt, continued employment, or obligations that made independence more symbolic than real. Some masters freed an elderly or sick slave simply to avoid the cost of their upkeep. A freed person without family or resources could find survival harder than it had been in servitude. Theoretically, a slave could buy their own freedom by saving wages or tips, but most slaves earned nothing. Only those in certain positions, such as skilled artisans hired out by their masters, could accumulate wealth. Even then, the decision rested with the master. Money did not guarantee manumission. In rare cases, foreign-born slaves, especially Nubian or Libyan captives, could earn freedom through service in Egypt's armies. Military service was dangerous, but it offered a narrow path to independence and land grants. However, this was more common for bondservants and mercenaries than for household or agricultural slaves. For the vast majority, death was the only certain end to slavery. The burial of a slave depended on their master's means and regard for them. In the poorest cases, bodies were placed in shallow graves outside village walls, wrapped in reed mats or old linen. Wealthier households sometimes arranged for more formal burials, though still far below the splendor given to free citizens. Few grave goods were buried with slaves, perhaps a jar of beer, a loaf of bread, or a personal tool. These were not elaborate tombs meant to secure an afterlife. They were practical gestures of farewell. Egyptian religion promised eternal life to those who lived in harmony with Ma'at, cosmic order, and received proper burial rites. But for slaves, access to these rites was uncertain. Some masters arranged for their slaves to be remembered in funerary texts or buried near them, not out of equality, but as part of their household even in death. Others saw no need to extend such privileges. For many slaves, the afterlife was an uncertain hope, shaped by their master's piety or indifference. Even when an individual slave died, the institution continued through their children. Unless freed, children inherited their mother's status and remained in bondage. This meant that a single slave family could serve the same household for generations, their names and faces changing, but their position unaltered. Egypt's monuments, temples, palaces, tombs bear the mark of slave labor. While not all construction was done by slaves, many large projects used paid laborers or corvée service. Enslaved people filled the most exhausting and dangerous roles: quarrying stone, hauling blocks, mixing mortar in the burning sun. Agricultural estates enriched temples and elites through the work of enslaved farmers who harvested grain, pressed oil, and tended animals. Their contributions were largely invisible in official records, but essential to Egypt's wealth. Egyptian inscriptions rarely speak from the slave's point of view. The grand hieroglyphs on temple walls record Pharaoh's conquests, not the cries of the people those conquests enslaved. What little we know comes from scattered legal documents, household accounts, and occasional graffiti, fleeting traces of lives lived in service, without power. Despite centuries of bondage, enslaved communities preserved elements of their own heritage: songs, prayers, cooking techniques, and craft styles. These quiet acts of cultural persistence were forms of survival. Some of Egypt's Egyptian traditions were in fact shaped by the hands and minds of foreign-born slaves whose influence became woven into the fabric of everyday life. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, Egypt's slavery has not lived as vividly in popular historical memory. Perhaps this is because it was spread over millennia, woven into the rhythm of daily life rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic era. But the absence of memory does not mean absence of suffering. Every monumental wall, every temple court, was built by hands that did not belong to the free. For the average Egyptian slave, freedom was not a journey, but a rare accident. Most were born in bondage, lived within the confines of another's will, and died as part of someone else's household inventory. The system did not need to hunt for runaways in large numbers because the greater prison was built in sand, stone, and the laws of inheritance.